3 months had passed since the children first arrived at Harmony Station. The habitat wing that had seemed so strange and temporary now felt like home. The dark corridors held memories of games and lessons and quiet moments of connection. The children who had arrived as frightened strangers had become a community, and the humans who cared for them had become something like family. Katie stood at the observation window watching a Courtney transport ship approach the station. The crisis on their homeworld had been resolved. The spatial anomaly had been contained through a combined effort of multiple species, including humans who had volunteered their ships and technology to help. The evacuation was complete. Families who had been separated were finally ready to reunite. Elder Voxran had stayed on the station for the entire 3 months. He had watched the children grow and change with eyes that gradually shifted from suspicious to wondering. He spent hours talking with Katie about human approaches to raising young. He observed Daniel Perry treating injuries with gentle patience. He watched Lucy Bennett leading classes where children from a warrior culture learned to paint pictures and tell stories. Each observation seemed to crack open something that had been sealed inside him for a long time. Now he stood beside Katie at the window, his aged scales catching the light from distant stars. He told her that he had sent reports back to the Courtney Council throughout his stay. At first, his reports had been cautious, full of warnings about potential dangers. But as time passed, his messages changed. He began describing what he witnessed without judgment, letting the council draw their own conclusions. By the final month, he was actively recommending that the Courtney study human methods of child-rearing. Katie asked what kind of response he had received. Voxran made a sound that might have been a laugh. He said there had been much debate. The traditionalists were outraged. They claimed he had been corrupted by alien influence and should be removed from his position. But the younger generation listened differently. They saw the reports from their children, the messages sent through official channels describing safety and kindness and play. They wanted to know more. Ambassador Pela requested a private meeting with Katie the day before the children were scheduled to depart. Katie found her in a small conference room, looking uncomfortable but determined. The Delvani diplomat apologized for her earlier demands. She admitted that fear had controlled her responses from the beginning. Generations of trauma had made her people see threats everywhere, even in places where none existed. She said that watching the presentation had forced her to confront things she had never questioned before. The Courtney children were not the monsters her instincts had warned her about. They were just children trying to survive in a frightening galaxy. She asked if humans would consider hosting cultural exchange programs for Delvani youth as well. Perhaps if her people's children learned to interact with other species while young, the cycle of fear could finally be broken. Katie agreed to present the idea to Commander Harris. She thought there was a good chance he would support it. The events of the past 3 months had changed many minds on the station. The Vareni observer Raxul made an announcement that surprised everyone during a diplomatic gathering. He said his people's council had voted on a significant matter based on his reports from Harmony Station. The Vareni had decided to request human assistance in reforming their youth development practices. For generations, they had abandoned young ones who showed signs of weakness. This tradition had cost them countless lives that might have contributed to their society. They were finally ready to consider another way. Katie felt tears threatening again. She had not expected such a response from a species that had seemed so committed to their harsh traditions. But Raxul had watched and listened and thought for 3 months. He had seen living proof that nurturing the vulnerable did not weaken a society. It strengthened the foundations upon which everything else was built. Commander Harris received communications from Earth that confirmed what many had already suspected. The events at Harmony Station had triggered a diplomatic shift across the galaxy. Multiple predator species were requesting human consultants for childcare and youth development. The reputation humans had built as protectors of children had been transformed from a curiosity into a valuable asset. Governments and organizations were offering substantial resources in exchange for human expertise. The day of departure arrived with mixed emotions. The children gathered in the habitat one final time, their scales clean and bright, their eyes carrying both excitement and sorrow. They would see their families again. They would return to their own people and their own worlds. But they would leave behind the place where they had first learned that asking for help was not shameful. Thren found Katie before the departure ceremony. He carried something wrapped in ceremonial cloth, and his manner was more formal than she had ever seen. He told her that he had a gift, something he hoped she would accept. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a blade made of polished metal. Katie recognized it from her studies as a Courtney honor blade, a weapon given only to warriors who had proven themselves in ways that truly mattered. The giving of such a blade was one of the highest honors in their culture. Thren explained that the blade had belonged to his father. It was the only possession he had been allowed to bring when he left home. He wanted Katie to have it because she had taught him what true strength meant. She had shown him that protecting others, especially those who could not protect themselves, was the highest form of courage. He would never forget what she had given him. Katie accepted the blade with trembling hands. She did not have words for what she felt, so she simply embraced him gently. He stiffened at first, still not fully comfortable with physical affection. But then his small arms wrapped around her in return, and for a moment they stood together as proof that understanding could bridge any gap. Elder Voxren made a formal declaration before the Courtney ships departed. He stood before the assembled representatives of many species and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of ancient authority. He declared that from this day forward, the Courtney would consider humans to be guardians of honor. This title was reserved for those trusted with the most sacred responsibility their people recognized, the protection of children. No Courtney would ever forget what humans had done for their young. The ships departed one by one, carrying children back to families who had waited and worried for months. Katie watched them go from the observation deck, Daniel and Lucy standing with her in quiet companionship. The station felt emptier already, but the impact of what had happened would echo far beyond these walls. Commander Harris joined them after the last ship vanished into the distance. He told Katie that she had started something bigger than any of them had imagined. The galaxy was watching what happened here, and they liked what they saw. He asked if she was ready for what came next. Katie did not know exactly what the future held, but she felt prepared to face it. She had seen children transform in ways that should have been impossible. She had watched ancient prejudices crumble against the simple truth of compassion. She had witnessed the beginning of something that might change how species throughout the galaxy related to each other. 6 months later, Katie stood before the first class of the Galactic Youth Development Institute. The facility had been built on Harmony Station, funded by contributions from dozens of worlds. Students from predator and prey species sat together in the same room, a sight that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. Young Courtney exchanged cautious greetings with young Delvani. Vareni children learned to play alongside species their parents had never trusted. Katie looked out at the gathered students and felt something warm bloom in her chest. This was what humanity could offer the galaxy. Not superior technology or military might. Not political cleverness or economic power. Something simpler and more profound. She began her lecture with words she had thought about for months. She said that every child, regardless of species, deserved to be protected. Every child deserved to be nurtured and taught that asking for help was the first step toward true strength. Every child deserved to know that they mattered. Not because of what they could do or what they would become, but simply because they existed. The galaxy had spent too long teaching its young to fear and fight and hide. Perhaps it was time to teach them something different. Perhaps it was time to show them that vulnerability was not weakness, that compassion was not foolishness, and that the courage to love was the greatest strength of all. The students listened with bright eyes and open hearts. They were the future, and the future was finally learning to see children as children, worthy of protection and love no matter what form they took. Outside the windows, ships from a dozen worlds passed through the station, carrying the business of a galaxy slowly learning to trust. And in the classroom, the first generation of a new era began their education in the most important subject any civilization could teach: how to care for each other. The day of the presentation arrived with an unexpected complication. Elder Voxren, one of the most senior diplomats in Korthny society, had come to Harmony Station without warning. He was an old male with faded scales and sharp eyes that missed nothing. His reputation preceded him. Voxren was a traditionalist who had opposed the decision to entrust Korthny children to humans. He believed it showed weakness and brought shame upon their people. He had come to ensure the children had not been corrupted by their time among aliens. Katie learned of his arrival only hours before the presentation was scheduled to begin. She found Calvash pacing nervously in the habitat, watching the children prepare while stealing worried glances at the door. The caretaker explained that Voxren had the authority to cancel everything. If he decided that the children had been damaged by human influence, he could order them removed immediately. There was no time to change the plan. Katie gathered the children and spoke to them honestly. She told them an important elder had come to watch them. He would judge whether their time with humans had helped them or hurt them. She could not tell them what to say or how to behave. She could only ask them to be themselves, to show the galaxy who they really were. The diplomatic hall had been transformed for the presentation. Seats arranged in a gentle curve faced a central platform where the children would speak. Soft lighting made the space feel warm rather than harsh. Dr. Hannah Cole, a xenobiologist who had been consulting on the project, stood ready to provide scientific context when needed. Representatives from every species on the station filled the seats. Ambassador Pela sat near the front, her expression guarded but no longer openly hostile. The Voreni observer Rasul had brought 2 additional members of his delegation. Senator Grace Kim sat with Commander Harris near the back, ready to respond to whatever happened. And Elder Voxren took a position standing against the wall, his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on the platform. Dr. Cole opened the presentation with factual information about Korthny childhood development. She explained that despite their predatory appearance, Korthny children had the same basic emotional needs as any young sentient being. They needed security, affection, and guidance. They needed to feel safe enough to learn and grow. Their biology made them look frightening to some species, but their hearts were the hearts of children. Then the young Korthny began to share. The first was a small female with bright, blue scales. Her voice shook as she spoke, but she did not stop. She said she missed her mother. Every night she dreamed about home, about the warmth of her mother's embrace. She did not know if her mother was safe or if she would ever see her again. The fear of losing her family forever was the hardest thing she had ever faced. Several members of the audience shifted uncomfortably. This was not what they had expected. They had prepared for displays of aggression or dominance. Instead, they were witnessing raw emotional honesty from a creature they had assumed incapable of such feelings. A young male came forward next. He was one of the more aggressive children, often getting into conflicts with others in the habitat. But today his claws were retracted and his posture was open. He admitted that he was afraid of the darkness of space. Their transport through the void had terrified him. He had nightmares about floating alone in the empty black, forgotten and lost. He had never told anyone before because admitting fear was not allowed. One by one, the children spoke. They talked about missing their homes and families. They shared their worries about the future. They expressed hopes that had been forbidden before. One child wanted to become a healer instead of a warrior. Another dreamed of making music, something considered worthless in traditional Courtney culture. A third simply wanted to have friends who did not see her as a rival to be defeated. Ambassador Pela watched with wide eyes. Her hands, which had been clenched tightly in her lap, slowly relaxed. She was seeing the predator children not as threats, but as frightened young ones far from home. The instinctive fear that had ruled her responses began to weaken against the evidence before her. Elder Voxran remained motionless against the wall. His expression gave nothing away. Katie could not tell if he was moved by what he saw or disgusted by the display of vulnerability. Finally, Thren took his place on the platform. He stood tall, despite his small size, his emerald scales gleaming under the lights. He looked at the assembled audience without flinching, then began to speak. He said that all his life he had been taught that needing others was weakness. Strength meant standing alone, depending on no one. Asking for help meant admitting failure. He had believed these things completely until he came to this station and met the humans. The humans had confused him at first. They were soft and slow and could not hunt. They should have been easy to dominate. But they did not try to dominate anyone. Instead, they offered care without demanding submission. They treated wounds without keeping score. They played games without winners and losers. They looked at frightened children and said it was okay to be afraid. He paused, gathering his thoughts. The room was completely silent. Thren continued. He said the humans had taught him something his own people never could. They showed him that asking for help was not weakness. It was trust. Trusting someone enough to be vulnerable with them required more courage than fighting alone. Anyone could hide behind armor and pretend to be strong. It took real bravery to remove that armor and show what was underneath. He said he did not know if the other species would accept his people. He did not know if the fear and hatred built over generations could ever be overcome. But he knew that his people's children had changed. They had learned that there were other ways to be strong. And maybe, if others were willing to see them as they truly were, everyone could change together. When he finished, several members of the audience were quietly wiping their eyes. Even some of the predator species representatives looked affected. The children's honesty had cut through political barriers and ancient prejudices to touch something universal. Dr. Cole concluded the formal presentation with a summary of the children's progress during their time on the station. She showed data on improved physical health, reduced aggression, and increased cooperative behavior. The numbers supported what everyone had just witnessed. These children were thriving under human care in ways they never had before. When the presentation ended, Elder Voxran moved from his position against the wall. The room tensed as he walked toward the platform where the children still stood. Katie stepped forward, ready to intervene if necessary. But she did not know what she could do against such an important figure. Voxran stopped in front of Thren. The old male looked down at the young one who had spoken so bravely about weakness and strength. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Voxran turned and approached Katie directly. His golden eyes studied her with an intensity that made her want to step back. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotions she could not identify. He asked her a single question. How did she know that showing vulnerability would make his people's children stronger instead of weaker? How could she have been certain that removing their armor would help them rather than destroy them? Katie met his gaze without looking away. She told him the truth. She had not been certain. She had only known what she believed about children. Every child, regardless of species, needed to feel safe enough to express their true selves. Every child needed to know that they would not be punished for having feelings. Strength that came from hiding was brittle and broke under pressure. Strength that came from acceptance could bend without breaking. She said she had hoped that Courtney children were not so different from human children in the ways that mattered most. And the children themselves had proven that hope was justified. Vox Ren was quiet for a very long time. The room waited in anxious silence. Finally, the elder spoke again. He said he had come to this station expecting to find his people's children corrupted and weakened. He had prepared arguments for why they should be removed immediately and never trusted to outsiders again. He had believed that the decision to seek human help was a mistake that would bring shame upon the Courtney for generations. He paused, and when he continued, his voice was softer. He said he had been wrong. He had watched the children speak with courage he had rarely seen in adult warriors. They had faced their fears openly and offered truth to strangers who had every reason to reject them. That was not weakness. That was a kind of strength his people had forgotten. Katie felt tears forming in her eyes as Voxren turned back to face the audience. He declared that the Courtney children would remain under human protection until their families could reclaim them. Any who questioned this decision could bring their concerns to him personally. He would be happy to explain why showing the courage to change was the highest form of Courtney honor. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Ambassador Pela stood slowly, her expression thoughtful. She looked at the children on the platform, then at Katie, then at Voxren. Something had shifted in her understanding. She was not ready to embrace predators as friends, but she was no longer certain they had to be enemies. After the presentation ended and the delegations dispersed, Voxren found Katie one more time. He told her that she had given his people a gift they did not deserve. The emergency meeting began at dawn. Commander Harris had gathered representatives from every major species delegation on Harmony Station. The conference room was filled with tension as Ambassador Pela stood at the center and presented her case. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words were sharp and clear. She said her people could not function knowing that predator children were living so close to them. The Delvani had spent generations being hunted by species like the Courtney. The trauma was written into their very biology. Every instinct screamed at them to flee whenever they sensed a predator nearby. How could they be expected to work and live normally under such conditions? Several other delegations voiced their support. A representative from the Zelkari suggested that the children should be moved to a remote section of the station, where contact with other species would be limited. A Vareni observer named Raxul watched the proceedings with unreadable eyes. Saying nothing but clearly interested in the outcome. Katie sat near the back of the room, listening to the arguments with growing frustration. These people were talking about the children as if they were dangerous animals to be contained. They had not seen the small ones laughing during games or the older children learning to help each other. They only saw teeth and claws and scales. They saw threats instead of children. Senator Grace Kim arrived from Earth midway through the meeting. She was a veteran diplomat with decades of experience navigating difficult situations. Her presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. People straightened in their seats and chose their words more carefully. Grace had a reputation for fairness, but also for refusing to accept easy solutions that caused harm to vulnerable populations. She listened to the remaining arguments, asked several pointed questions, and then requested a private meeting with Commander Harris, Katie, and Ambassador Vexnar. In the smaller room, away from the politics of the larger gathering, she spoke directly. Grace said she understood the concerns of the Delvani and other species. Fear was a powerful emotion, and dismissing it would only make things worse. But she also understood that 200 children were depending on them for safety. These were not soldiers or warriors. They were young ones who had been torn from their homes because of a disaster beyond their control. Punishing them for the biology they were born with was not something she was willing to do. Vexnar spoke then. His voice heavy with emotion he struggled to contain. He said his people had made a terrible choice in coming here. They had believed the stories about human compassion, about the species that protected all children regardless of origin. Perhaps those stories were exaggerated. Perhaps he should take his people's young ones elsewhere and face whatever consequences came. Katie interrupted before he could continue. She told him that running away would not help anyone. The children had already begun to trust humans. Taking them away now would only confirm their belief that the galaxy was a hostile place where no one could be trusted. They had to find another way. Grace agreed. She proposed a solution that would require courage from everyone involved. She suggested a formal presentation where the other species could observe the children in a controlled environment. They would see the young ones as individuals rather than symbols of ancient threats. It was risky, because any mistake could make the situation worse. But it might be the only way to change enough minds to matter. Commander Harris supported the idea, but warned that organizing such an event would take time they might not have. Ambassador Pela was gathering support for a formal vote to expel the children from the station. If that vote happened before the presentation, everything would be lost. While the diplomats worked on buying time, Katie returned to the children's habitat to face a different kind of challenge. She needed to prepare the children for the presentation. She needed to ask them to do something that went against everything their culture had taught them. She needed them to show vulnerability. Kelvash listened to the plan with obvious discomfort. She warned that what Katie was asking was nearly impossible. Korthani children were raised to hide their true feelings at all costs. Asking them to share their hopes and fears with strangers was like asking them to walk into battle without armor. Some would rather die than show such weakness. Katie understood the difficulty, but she also knew they had no other choice. If the children could not prove they were more than the monsters others imagined them to be, they would be sent away to face an uncertain fate. She asked Kalvash to trust her, just as the children were learning to trust. That evening, Katie gathered the children and explained the situation in simple terms. She told them that some people on the station were afraid of them. These people had never met Korthani children before. They only knew stories of war and hunting and violence. The only way to show them the truth was to let them see who the children really were. Not warriors, not predators, just young ones who wanted to be safe and loved like everyone else. The children reacted with confusion and resistance. One older female said that showing weakness would only invite attack. A young male argued that they should prove their strength instead, to make the other species too scared to threaten them. Several children simply refused to participate at all. Thrn had been listening from his usual position at the edge of the group. Now he stepped forward, and his voice silenced the others. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. He said the humans had shown them something new. They had shown strength in ways the children did not understand at first. The human healer treated their wounds without demanding anything in return. The human teacher played games with them without keeping score. The human woman with kind eyes had looked at him when he tried to frighten her and simply told him she would wait until he was ready. He said these humans were not weak. They were strong in different ways. Maybe there were other kinds of strength that the Korthani had never learned. Maybe showing the truth of what they felt was not weakness, but courage. It took more bravery to remove armor than to hide behind it. The children listened to Thren with growing wonder. He was one of the fiercest among them, the one who had resisted the longest. If he believed this, perhaps it was true. Meanwhile, the Voreni observer Raxul sought out Katie for a private conversation. He found her preparing materials for the presentation and asked if he could watch. She agreed, curious about his interest. Raxul told her that his people were also predators. They had their own traditions regarding the young, traditions that he was beginning to question. Among the Voreni, children who showed weakness were abandoned. Only the strong deserved to survive. It was considered merciful to remove the weak before they could suffer more. He asked Katie how humans managed to nurture their helpless offspring for so many years. Human children could not hunt or fight or even walk for a long time after birth. How did they survive? How did humans keep their young alive long enough to become strong? Katie explained that human survival had always depended on community. No single human could raise a child alone. It required families, villages, entire societies working together. Protecting the vulnerable was not weakness, but the foundation of everything else. A society that abandoned its weakest members was a society that would eventually abandon itself. Raxul was silent for a long time. Then he said he had much to think about. He left without another word, but something in his expression had changed. The day before the presentation, a crisis threatened to ruin everything. A young Courtney child wandered into a corridor near the Delvani quarters. She was looking for a toy she had lost, and she meant no harm. But when a Delvani aide saw her, the aide panicked. She screamed and tried to run, tripping over her own feet and falling hard against the wall. Security arrived to find the child frozen in confusion and the aide injured on the floor. Ambassador Pela called for an emergency meeting. She said this incident proved that coexistence was impossible. The children were a danger simply by existing near her people. She demanded an immediate vote on expulsion. Katie rushed to the scene and found Thren already there. He had followed the young child and witnessed everything. Before anyone could stop him, he approached Ambassador Pela and spoke in broken but understandable common language. He apologized on behalf of his people. He said they never meant to cause fear. They only wanted to be safe, just like the Delvani. They did not want to hurt anyone. The room fell silent. No one had expected a Courtney child to apologize to a prey species. It went against everything observers thought they knew about predator culture. Kelvash watched with tears in her eyes as Thren humbled himself before creatures his ancestors had once hunted. Ambassador Pela stared at the young male for a long moment. Her expression shifted through several emotions before settling on uncertainty. She said she needed time to think. The vote would wait until after the presentation. As they walked back to the habitat, Katie asked Thren how he had learned to speak the common language so well. He admitted he had been studying in secret, listening to the humans and practicing alone at night. He wanted to find ways to help. He wanted to prove that his people could change. Katie placed her hand gently on his scaled shoulder. She told him he had already proven more than he knew. The transport vessel Crimson Dawn was unlike any ship Katie had ever boarded. The corridors were dark and warm, designed for creatures who preferred shadows to light. The air carried a strange scent that reminded her of copper and earth. She followed Vexenar through the narrow passages, her heart beating faster with each step. Somewhere ahead, 200 children waited in fear and confusion, not knowing what would become of them. They reached a large chamber that had been converted into a temporary shelter. Katie stopped at the entrance and took in the sight before her. Dozens of small figures huddled in groups throughout the room. They were Courtney children, and they were both beautiful and terrifying. Their scales ranged from deep green to dark blue, and their golden eyes reflected the dim lighting like tiny flames. Some were barely larger than human toddlers, while others approached the size of human teenagers. All of them watched her with intense focus, their small bodies tense and ready to react. A female Courtney approached and introduced herself as Kelvash. She was the primary caretaker assigned to stay with the children wherever they went. Her voice was gentle but tired, and Katie could see the strain in her posture. Caring for this many frightened young ones was exhausting work. Kelvash explained the challenge they faced. Courtney children were taught from their earliest days that showing weakness meant death. In their culture, Vulnerability invited attack. Children learned to hide their fear, their pain, and their needs. They competed with each other constantly, establishing dominance through displays of aggression. Asking for help was considered shameful. Admitting fear was unthinkable. These children had already survived selection processes that eliminated those considered too weak. They were the strongest of their generation, which meant they were also the most guarded. Katie observed the children more closely. She noticed that several were clearly frightened, despite their fierce postures. A small female with blue scales kept glancing at the door, as if expecting danger to burst through at any moment. A group of young males puffed themselves up and displayed their claws, trying to intimidate each other and anyone watching. But their movements were too nervous, too quick. They were performing strength they did not feel. One child caught her attention more than the others. He was a young male with scales the color of dark emeralds. He stood apart from the groups, watching Katie with an intensity that felt almost hostile. When she met his eyes, he bared his teeth and extended his claws in clear warning. Kelvash told her his name was Thren, and he was one of the oldest children in the group. He had lost both parents already and trusted no one. Katie made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. Instead of backing away from the aggressive display, she walked slowly toward Thren. The other children fell silent, watching to see what would happen. Kelvash called out a warning, but Katie raised her hand to show she understood the risk. She stopped a few feet from Thren and lowered herself to his eye level. He was shaking now, though he tried to hide it. His claws were fully extended, and his teeth gleamed in the low light. He could hurt her badly if he chose to attack. She knew this, and she stayed anyway. She spoke to him in a soft, calm voice. She told him that she could see he was scared. Being taken from his home and placed among strangers was frightening. Not knowing what would happen to his family was painful. These feelings were normal and natural. They did not make him weak. They made him alive. Thren stared at her with wide eyes. His claws slowly retracted as confusion replaced aggression. No adult had ever spoken to him this way before. No one had ever acknowledged his fear without punishing him for showing it. He did not know how to respond, so he simply stood there, frozen between attack and acceptance. Katie smiled gently and told him that he did not need to trust her today. Trust was earned, not demanded. But she wanted him to know that she would be here when he was ready. Then she stood and walked back to Kelvash, leaving Thren to process what had happened. The transfer of children to Harmony Station took place the following day. Katie had worked through the night with her colleagues to prepare a habitat wing for the young Korthany. They adjusted the lighting to match the dim conditions of the transport ship. They modified the temperature and humidity. They removed anything that might seem threatening or confusing. By the time the children arrived, the space felt as close to home as they could make it. Daniel Perry was the human medical officer assigned to monitor the children's health. He was a patient man with steady hands and a quiet voice. Katie had worked with him before and trusted his judgment completely. As the children settled into their new environment, Daniel began conducting medical examinations. What he found disturbed them both deeply. Many children had injuries that had never been treated. Cuts, bruises, and even broken bones that had healed incorrectly. When Daniel asked about these wounds, the children refused to answer or claimed they felt no pain. Kelvash explained that reporting injuries was seen as admitting weakness. Children were expected to endure pain without complaint. Seeking medical help was shameful unless the injury was life-threatening. Daniel looked at Katie with sadness in his eyes. He said these were just children. They should not have to pretend that broken bones did not hurt. Katie agreed, but she knew that changing such deep cultural conditioning would take time and patience. Lucy Bennett arrived the next day to begin educational programming. She was a teacher who specialized in adapting learning materials for different species. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and her creativity had helped dozens of alien children adjust to life among humans. But even she was challenged by what she learned about Courtney childhood. Courtney children had never been allowed to play. Play was considered wasteful behavior that contributed nothing to survival. Every activity had to serve a purpose, usually combat training or competition. The children did not know how to relax or enjoy themselves without feeling guilty. They had no concept of games that did not end with winners and losers. Katie suggested starting with physical activities that channeled their natural instincts in constructive ways. Courtney children needed to move, to hunt, to chase. They could not sit still for long periods like some species. So Katie and Lucy designed games that looked like play but felt like training. Obstacle courses that rewarded speed and agility. Team competitions that required cooperation. Hunting simulations that ended with treats instead of prey. Slowly the children began to engage. At first, they approached the activities with deadly seriousness, as if their lives depended on winning. But over time, something shifted. A young female laughed when she stumbled during a race. Two males who had been rivals helped each other complete a difficult climb. A small child who had never spoken above a whisper shouted with joy when she won a game. Katie watched these small miracles with growing hope. The children were capable of joy. They had simply never been given permission to feel it. Thren remained apart from the others. He watched the activities from a distance, never joining in but never looking away. Katie noticed that each day he moved a little closer. He was curious despite himself, drawn to the strange new world the humans were creating. She did not push him to participate. She simply made sure he knew he was welcome whenever he was ready. The other species on Harmony Station watched these developments with mixed reactions. Some were fascinated by the experiment. Others were worried about having predator children so close to their own people. Commander Harris fielded dozens of complaints and concerns daily. He did his best to reassure everyone that the situation was under control, but he could feel the tension building. Then the Delvani delegation arrived, and everything became more complicated. The Delvani were a prey species with a long history of conflict with predators. Their representative, Ambassador Pela, took one look at the Courtney children's habitat and filed a formal protest. She demanded that the children be removed from the station immediately. Their presence, she claimed, was an unacceptable threat to her people's safety and mental well-being. Katie heard about the complaint during dinner. She set down her food and went directly to Commander Harris's office. She found him looking tired and frustrated, surrounded by diplomatic messages and formal complaints. He told her that Pela had support from several other delegations. If they could not find a solution soon, the situation might become unmanageable. Katie asked what he planned to do. He said he did not know yet. But whatever happened, he would not abandon those children. They had come here seeking protection, and Harmony Station would provide it. They just needed to figure out how to do that without starting an interstellar incident. Katie returned to the children's habitat that night. She found them sleeping in small groups, their bodies curled together for warmth and comfort. Even in sleep, they looked guarded. But here and there, she saw signs of change. A child with an arm draped over a former rival. A small one clutching a blanket that Lucy had given her. Thren, still separate from the others, but facing toward them instead of away, that these children deserve better than fear and rejection. Katie was determined to give it to them, no matter what it took. The message arrived at Harmony Station during the quiet hours of the night cycle. Commander Ben Harris sat in his office reviewing trade agreements when his console flashed with an urgent diplomatic request. He read the sender identification 3 times before believing it. The Courtney wanted to meet. Not just any Courtney, but Ambassador Vexinar himself, one of the most respected figures among their people. The Korthani were a predator species known throughout the galaxy for their warrior culture and fierce independence. They rarely sought contact with other species unless war was involved. Ben had served in the military for 20 years before taking this administrative post, and he had seen Korthani warriors in battle. They were terrifying creatures with scaled bodies, retractable claws, and teeth designed for tearing flesh. The idea of one requesting a peaceful meeting made him nervous in ways he could not fully explain. He sent his acceptance and spent the remaining hours wondering what could possibly bring such a species to his station seeking help. Harmony Station existed at the edge of Galactic Council territory, serving as neutral ground where different species could conduct sensitive business away from political pressures. Humans had built it 60 years ago, shortly after first contact with the wider galactic community. In that time, humanity had earned a reputation as reliable mediators and fair dealers. But the Korthani had never shown interest in human friendship before. The Korthani vessel arrived the next morning. It was a warship, heavily armed and bearing the scars of many battles. Ben watched it dock from the observation deck, noting how the other ships in the area gave it wide clearance. Even among predator species, the Korthani commanded fear and respect. He straightened his uniform and went to meet his guests. Ambassador Vexinar was smaller than Ben expected. The Korthani stood only slightly taller than an average human, with dark green scales that shifted color in the station lighting. His eyes were golden with vertical pupils, and when he spoke, Ben could see rows of sharp teeth behind thin lips. But there was something in those alien eyes that Ben recognized. He had seen it in the faces of soldiers who had witnessed terrible things. It was desperation hidden behind a mask of dignity. The ambassador brought only 2 guards, which was unusual for a species that valued strength in numbers. They followed Ben to a private meeting room, and once the doors closed, Vexinar spoke directly without any of the formal greetings that most species preferred. He told Ben that his people faced a crisis. Their homeworld was threatened by a spatial anomaly, an expanding rift in space that would make their planet uninhabitable within months. They were evacuating their population to colony worlds, but the process was dangerous and slow. Many would not survive the journey. Ben expressed his sympathy and asked how Harmony Station could assist with the evacuation. Vexinar shook his head and said the evacuation was not why he had come. His people could handle that themselves. What he needed was something far more difficult. He needed humans to protect something precious during the crisis. Ben waited, confused by the direction of the conversation. Vexinar explained that the most vulnerable members of their society were the young. Korthani children could not survive the harsh conditions of emergency evacuation. The journey required adults to endure extreme environments, limited resources, and constant danger. Children would slow them down, and many would die. The Korthani had decided to send their young away to safety while the adults completed the evacuation. 200 children needed shelter and protection until their families could reclaim them. Ben understood now why the ambassador looked so desperate. He was asking strangers to care for his people's children. For any species, that was a tremendous act of trust. For the Korthani, whose culture valued strength and self-reliance above all else, it must have been almost unbearable. He asked why the Korthani had chosen humans for this task. There were other species better equipped to handle predator children. There were species with similar biology, similar cultural values, similar needs. Humans were small, soft, and weak compared to Korthani. They could not match the strength or speed of predator young. Why trust them with something so important? Vexinar was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said his people had watched humans for decades. They had observed human behavior in conflicts, in negotiations, in moments of crisis and peace. They had seen something that no other species seemed to possess. Humans protected children. Not just their own children, but all children. They had watched human soldiers risk their lives to save enemy young from danger. They had seen human diplomats argue passionately for the rights of children from species that hated humanity. They had witnessed humans adopt orphaned young from dozens of different worlds, raising them as their own regardless of species. Other predator species saw children as future competitors or threats to be controlled. Prey species feared predator young and wanted them kept away. But humans looked at children and saw only children. They did not care about fangs or claws or scales. They saw small beings who needed protection and love, and they provided both without hesitation. Ben sat back in his chair and considered what he had heard. It was true that humans had a powerful protective instinct toward the young. It was something built into their biology and reinforced by their culture. Human children were helpless for years, requiring constant care and protection. This had shaped human society in fundamental ways. They formed communities around the raising of children. They built institutions to educate and protect the young. They wrote laws to shield children from harm. It was so natural to humans that they rarely thought about it. But to an outside observer, it must have seemed remarkable. He told Vexnar that he would need to consult with others before making such a significant decision. The ambassador nodded and said he understood, but his eyes betrayed his anxiety. Time was short. The evacuation would begin soon, and the children needed to be secured before then. Ben called for his diplomatic liaison, a woman named Zara Cole, who had experience working with predator species. He also requested the presence of Katie Morgan, the station's childcare specialist and xenopsychologist. Katie had spent her career studying how different species raise their young. If anyone could assess whether humans were capable of caring for Cathini children, it was her. Katie arrived within the hour. She was a practical woman in her mid-30s, with kind eyes and a calm manner. Ben had seen her handle crises with difficult species, always maintaining her composure and finding solutions that others missed. She listened as Vexnar repeated his request, asking occasional questions about Corthany childhood development and needs. When he finished, Katie asked a question that had been forming in Ben's mind. She wanted to know why the Corthany had not approached other predator species who might better understand their children's instincts and requirements. Caring for predator young was different from caring for prey species or omnivores like humans. The children would have hunting instincts, aggressive behaviors, and physical needs that humans might not be able to meet. Vexnar answered with painful honesty. He said they had considered other options. They had approached the Vareni, another predator species with similar biology. The Vareni had refused. They saw Corthany children as potential rivals who might grow strong enough to threaten their own young. They had approached the Zelkari, who were neither predator nor prey. The Zelkari had shown no interest in protecting anyone's children but their own. Every species they contacted had reasons to refuse. Only humans remained. Katie looked at Ben, and he saw her decision in her eyes before she spoke. She told Vexnar that she would need to see the children herself before making any recommendations. She wanted to visit the Corthany transport ship and observe them in their current environment. Only then could she determine if Harmony Station could provide what they needed. Vexnar agreed immediately. He seemed almost relieved that someone was willing to take the first step. He arranged for Katie to visit the transport vessel the following day. That night, Katie sat alone in her quarters and thought about what she had agreed to do. She had worked with children from many species, but never predators. She had no idea what waited for her on that ship. But she kept thinking about what Vexnar had said. Humans saw children as children, regardless of everything else. She hoped that would be enough.